tell you about his process, and he has some plans, and he has a little video that we'll do at the end that is hopefully going to be fine on our computer. And then we will, last of all, we'll go out and we'll take a look at the piece, which again is outside in the Johnston Hall, in the glass case, right outside the museum shop. And it's called Peep Show. And Dan can tell you about why it's called that. But Dan Burgette has been around for a long time here in the Valley, and some of you know him from when he was a climbing ranger in Grand Teton Park for how many years there?
27.
For 27 years. And when he was still doing that, he was doing his art. I don't know how he found time, but he was still doing his art part-time when he worked for Grand Teton National Park. And in fact, several years ago, I don't know how many, Dan was one of our artists in residence, and he spent a whole month here, back when we were doing those long artist in residence programs in the summertime. So he was out demonstrating and talking to people in Johnston Hall as part of that residency. He now is retired from the Park Service, and he's doing his art full time. He lives over in Drake's?
In Teutonia.
In Teutonia, yep. And he has won all kinds of awards for his artwork. He has his work represented locally at Rare Gallery. So if you haven't popped in there recently, pop in there and see more of Dan's work there. Thank you, Dan.
Remember, he was a judge for Junior.
Oh, yes, he was a judge for Junior Duxton.
Yeah.
And Dan, you missed this earlier in the meeting, but we have a summer intern coming, a young man named Andrew Nealand, who won Junior Duxton for the whole
I think you voted
country.
Oh,
So it all comes around.
that's right, that's right. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here at the museum. You know, this is such a tremendous resource for the Valley as well as the whole nation. You know, the collection here is just wonderful and inspiring. So we're going to talk today a little bit about the process I went through for making Peep Show, and it started with my desire to carve a flock of birds. And you know that gets to be tricky because it's really complex. And so basically, you know, people ask me how long did it take me to carve that, and I say 800 hours in 30 years. And the 30 years is the time it took to kind of educate myself. I don't have an art background, and so I've worked really hard to develop that right side of my brain and learn about, you know, different things in sculpture especially. But anyhow, one of the things I've learned over the years was that the goal of sculpture is to activate space using positive space and negative space, and try to enliven, you know, what's going on in space. And so to do a flock of birds, you know, it's kind of a complex thing, and the artist provides the viewer a certain amount of information. And I've carved what they call decorative birds, where I've carved every feather exactly the right dimensions and how they overlap and everything, and I've painted them the right colors, and I put them on a pine branch, and it's all painted with the pine cones and everything. And I don't really, you know, I provide all the information. People look at that and they say, those are Red Cross bills sitting on a pine branch. But what kind of turns me on more is what they call the interpretive thing, and I've won the world championship for wildfall carving in the interpretive division a couple times, and I like that because the artist provides a certain amount of information, but then it allows the viewer to add their own information from when they saw birds or whatever, and they can fill out the story. And it's always fun for me to hear someone tell their story, because it's not anything I would have thought of, but it's really kind of a neat sort of a thing. And so anyhow, that's part of the process I go through. And then when I'm trying to do a flock of birds that are flying, you get into the problem of that artists have of when you're doing a flying bird. Too often, the sculpture ends up being a bird on a stick. And so I played with that bird on a stick problem over the years by trying to envision that as birds fly through this medium we can't see called the air, they're disturbing all these millions of molecules of air. And so if a bird's going really fast, it disturbs those molecules in a different way than if the bird's flying slowly. And so I try to visualize that and then carve the air and suggest the relative speed that the bird's going, and some of those things. So those are some of the things that I play with. And so getting back to doing a flock of birds, you don't want to pick big birds because the whole sculpture gets huge. And so I picked peeps, the little sandpipers, semi-palmated sandpipers was what I was looking at. And for the last few years, I've been going up to the Arctic on canoe trips. And in the summer that I did this, I canoed on the Hood River, and I knew that the semi-palmated sandpipers nest up there. And so while I was canoeing along, luckily I had this little flock of 5 birds fly right by the bow of my canoe, went over and landed. I saw them fly in about 10 seconds, but it was exactly what I needed because they came by within 5 feet of me. There's all the kinetic energy of these flapping wings and everything, and they went over and landed. But it was perfect because it was that sense of energy that really what I ended up trying to carve. So when I did Peep Show, I really wasn't trying to carve birds. I was trying to carve that sense of energy of that little flock flying by. And so it gets back to the amount of information I'm going to give. And so I ended up doing the beaks of the birds pretty realistically and where the eyes are. And after that, it kind of all flows into different air currents. And then, of course, then you get into the engineering part, how do you support everything? And all those air currents had interconnect so that everything was strong enough to hold it up. Another problem was the material I used. I needed something that I knew that the air currents, I wanted them to be pretty thin, and so I needed the wood to be strong, so I chose maple. But I didn't want just a plain white maple so that the whole thing looked just white. I wanted a little bit of interest there. I wanted some figure to the wood. And so I looked for a big leaf maple, and I actually found a log that had burl all the way around it, and that burl has lots of real interesting grain. And so that was the piece that I chose. Then this was really a piece that really stretched me because how to interact all those different air currents and so that everything's kind of cohesive without having the air currents be too busy. I wanted the heads of the birds to be the focal point, so I needed those to be out in the front. I didn't want them just in a straight line, so I have them kind of in a wave, an arc, and I want them like they're kind of turning the corner like that little flock I saw. And so everything's at a 50-degree angle also. And so one of the things I did, well, this whole thing started out with different sketches in my little sketchbook. And I do have this little flock of birds flying over a wave. And the wave I wanted was when you're going down a rapids, and if the wind's coming up the river against you, the waves get really steep on that bottom side. And that's what I wanted. So I have a wave where the wind's pushing against it and the flock's flying into the wind. And so that's kind of the idea I started with. And then I knew the size of my and shape of the block of wood. It was a 200-pound block of maple, and it was totally green. It had just been cut. I got it out in Oregon. And working with wet wood is tricky because as it dries, then it checks and cracks and all that sort of stuff. And so you have to deal with some of those things. Also, the center of right in the very center of the log, there are some checks in there, so there's going to be cracks, and those cracks are going to be a problem as they run through these air currents. And so this piece ended up breaking 100 times. I got really good at kind of fixing all that. So it hasn't broken since I got finished. And anyhow, so the first thing I did was I did a full scale drawing, and I did a front and side view. I guess I didn't use side view. I just did the front view because the only thing there are 5 points that I had to have right. and that was the beaks on these 5 birds. So, well, actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually, I was going to do 7 birds originally. How many do we have over here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. This was the 3rd version of it. So I downgraded from 7 to make it a little simpler, to give me a little more space to open up. And so anyhow, this is so those 5 points were the things I had to have right. And so I put my log into a big vise called a jaw horse and clamped it into there. And then I located those 5 points exactly, on that log. And then I carved from there. And so basically, as long as you have the beaks where they're supposed to be, you have the wings on the angle you want, and all these air currents, they can go anywhere as long as they connect and hold things up. And so it's kind of a slow process of working through it. The wood was wet, and so I soaked the wood in a product called pentacryl, which is supposed to reduce the checking. Part of the problem there was it ran right through the crack all the way through the log and didn't soak up as much as I wanted. And so I took my chainsaw, and once I knew where these places, some of these areas in here, I could do plunge cuts with a chainsaw and try to open that up so I get some of the moisture out. And so that was kind of a process also. So anyhow, once you get started on that, then it's just a slow process. I started at the top and started defining the wings and then kind of working my way down. And all through this, I've just gone through my notebook here, and it'll also had reference material. You get off the internet of pictures of semi-palmated sandpipers, and so I had things like that, and then made little paper things, and so I put that on my log and kind of tracing around it. In my notes here, I see for 9 months I scratched my head about how I was ever going to get this thing to stand up, because I'm going to have this flock of birds, and so I thought, well, in order to make it really stable and strong, I was going to have to run a stainless steel rod out of the base I made in the wave I made in clay and had that cast in bronze. And so you had to have a stainless steel rod come out of the wave, up one of those air currents, through the body, down the wing, back through another air current, back down into the bronze. That'd be really good. Except I didn't know how to do that. So I've got pages and pages and pages of just trying to figure out how I was going to do that, and never really figured it out. But finally, when I got down, I had everything carved except for I was working on this last bird, and it was still pretty thick here, so I kept some wood down there to play with it up that. And I took it out of the jaw horse for the first time, and it only weighed 7 pounds. It was really light, so I weighed it. It's only 7 pounds. I thought, well, maybe I don't need all that stuff. And so I eventually just went with one in through the one air current, and that's perfectly fine, and it holds it up because the whole thing now went from that 200-pound log weighs. I kept the best 4.5 pounds. So anyhow, so that's kind of how we got to where we are. So any questions at this point?
So how long in all?
You went from 200 pounds to 7 pounds to 4.5 pounds with a chainsaw?
Oh no. That's a good thing to, because as it gets more thin, it's more fragile and all that sort of stuff. And so most of it was done with a cushion sander in a flexible rotary sort of a thing. And so this spins around it, and I can keep putting on new sandpaper, and a lot of it's 80 grit sandpaper. And so I can grind off stuff, and so I made over 100 gallons of dust. I have a fairly good dust collection system, plus I wore a mask and all that because dust is a real occupational hazard for doing the power carving. So
you call it power carving?
yeah, so I probably 90% of my stuff is done with power tools. I have a little thing that looks about the size of a cigar that goes forwards and backwards from 5,000 to 50,000 RPM. And you can use diamond grits and ruby bits and carbide bits and all sorts of different things at different size shapes and dental bits and various things. And so you can do, lots of different things, get into lots of different spaces. So anyhow, but this is just has a soft rubber around it, so it's kind of cushioned. And as the sandpaper wears out, then you pull out the center thing and put on new sandpaper and keep going on it. So, any other questions? Well, why don't we watch the video here? Okay, so there's our sculpture. So that's the 200-pound log, but you can see it has burl all the way around it. So that was.
It's beautiful in itself.
Yeah. And then you can see in the center of it, right in the very center, it's kind of rotten and it has the checks, and there's a few other places where there's kind of some bark and various things that you had to deal with. So one of the things I did, I just took aspen. I've got a lot of aspen that grows on my property, and when one falls down, I turn into carving wood. But I did some practice ones just to try to see how things are going to go together. So here I've just taken the chainsaw and flattened out where the front of those beaks are going to be, because they're not in a straight line, so I get that arc. And then I drew it in. So now I'm just starting to use my hatchet, my chainsaw, various things, but starting to work back, and leaving the face of those birds pretty flat, so there's plenty of wood there to work with. And you can see where I've taken the chainsaw and done those plunge cuts all the way through. And it's a little discolored from the penchacryl that I put on it, and I would soak that every night and then put a plastic bag over it and seal it tight so that I wanted the moisture to come out kind of in a controlled, slow fashion, so it didn't do a bunch of checking. Now it's just a matter of sneaking up on it. And you can see where I'm starting to work on that upper bird first.
How tall is it?
It's 38 inches total.
When you start?
And there you can see the cushion sander that I'm using. So that's just sanding off that wood, which takes a while. And you can see my dust collection. I don't have a super good dust collection, but I have that 5-inch pipe there that's sucking air all the time, and so that helps a lot. Just making things more thin as we go down. The bottom's still fairly thick. Get rid of that little thing at the bottom here.
I think if you click on your picture, it will probably go away. Maybe not.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, so the trick is to get that rod in the right place. It had to be 40 degrees from the top view. And so I lined up my glue over there at 40 degrees. Oh, now I've got to get that back. And it had to be 23 degrees coming up this way. And so I took a real long drill and had my wife and my neighbor try to line up the drill so it was lined up with my lines. And then, of course, the maple's really hard, and so I pushed too hard and it actually deflected the drill. So my hole wasn't straight. So once I got my hole drilled, I couldn't put a straight rod through it. So then I had to drill it out. So there's always problems. But that's how I got that. But right in the center there, you see kind of a gob of something dark. That's actually hot melt glue. That was one of the breaks I had, and I put Titebond 3 glue in there, kind of glued it back together, and then put kind of a big callus of hot melt glue over it to clamp it. Because when you have all these weird things that aren't straight, you can't just get a clamp and squeeze it tight. And so that's how I clamped a lot of those breaks. And then once the glue is cured, then I peel it off. So this is working on the bronze base. And then we sandblasted that. And then I took it home and I used acrylic paint for the patina. And that's pretty much done. I love the negative space from the back. And then I used Minwax wood sheen to seal it up. Actually, I sealed it and then I put Minwax wood sheen on it. They're just carved out of the wood. Yeah, and then there's a little bit of acrylic paint dark on it. So there you go, that's how it is. So now do you have any questions?
So how long in all would you say? How long, how many days, hours, months?
Well, I started in May and finished just before the World Show in April. So it is almost a year. And this piece didn't win anything at the World Show. It was beaten by the junkyard dog and another bird that was made to look like a model airplane, so whatever. How do you judge art?
Dumb judges.
Do you normally, for your process, do you normally like see a 36-inch, 200-pound piece of maple and go, oh, that could be it? Or do you draw and sketch and then?
It really depends. I don't understand the creative process. I get an idea of what I'd like to do, and somehow what ends up, it matches my idea. And I don't exactly know how I get from A to B. There's one time I spent 24 hours on a clay model of a kingfisher diving into the water and coming back out with a fish. And I was going to use that for my world piece, and so I went down and I've got about 30 species of wood in my stash under the house. And one of those was a big chunk of redwood that I picked up on the Pacific coast. And I went down and I sawed it in half and brought it up, threw it in the jaw horse, and it wasn't big enough, it wasn't wide enough for the clay model I had. And so I just, it had some interesting grain, and I did a little sketch and I just carved it. And it was a wonderful piece with a sharp-shinned hawk coming through a feeder called Feeder Frenzy and grabbed a songbird, and there's 3 other birds that are spinning away from it. And it was a wonderful piece, and that did win the World Championship. And actually, I just cast that piece in bronze now too. So, but anyhow, so sometimes I let the wood kind of direct what's going on. Other times I have an idea and I have a big block of wood. Redwood's great because you can get big blocks of wood. And I have my way with it, and I just do whatever my idea is. So it kind of depends on what happens. But I really like playing with burls and wood with funky grain, because you can kind of follow the grain and let that direct the carving. So, but it just depends. Yeah.
How do you get from a wood carving to a bronze?
Well, for that one, I'm actually doing more bronzes where I'm playing with clay. But for that one, my gallery owner in Charleston, South Carolina wanted me to cast some of my world pieces, and I said, well, I'd have to cut them apart to do it. And I had that particular piece, who my youngest son, when I was working on it, saw it in the shop there, and he says, I think that ought to be part of the Burgette collection. So that's his piece. So I still had that one at home. And it didn't have a lot of these air currents and stuff going on. And so I took it up to the foundry, and the mold maker says, yeah, he thought he could do it with just a couple scratches on it, and which he did. He did a great job.
Covering it with clay?
No, he covers it in latex.
Latex.
Yeah, latex and then plaster of Paris. Well, it's the same process you see in the case out here.
With the wood is the...
So instead of using, wax or whatever, you can use wood or stone or whatever and cast it from.
They cut it off with wood.
Yeah. So, any other questions?
Fascinating.